The origins of ancient Egypt. Where did the people of ancient Egypt come from, and how did they go from hunter-gatherers to pyramid builders? This is a video I've been planning on making for a while. I want to use this channel to share little bits of information about the world around us which interest me. One of those little bits happens to be the civilization of ancient Egypt. The first aspect of the Egyptians that simply amazes me is the longevity. 3,000 years is almost an incomprehensible amount of time to us mere mortals who live and die in the geological blink of an eye. I will be using this video to focus on the origins of the Egyptian culture. Everybody knows about the Great Pyramids, and this video will give a glimpse as to how this most famous of peoples got to the point where they could organise such a mammoth undertaking, and the many firsts the Egyptians had to achieve to reach a point that they could spend 20 years constructing the first of the Great Pyramids with nothing but manpower, determination and know-how. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy. The first signs we can discern of a culture beginning to blossom in this once fertile land of the Sahara goes all the way back to 17,000 BC in an area called Kurta, located on the east bank of the Nile. Here is where we find some fine examples of rock art, which is remarkably similar to the cave paintings found around Europe. These paintings consist of numerous depictions of local animals such as hippo and birds, but the most common was the aurochs, a now extinct ancestor of modern-day cattle. It is thought that these animals were the indigenous hunters' primary source of food, and beef is thought to have been around 50% of these nomadic people's diet. As the years progressed, more elaborate and detailed carvings emerged showing images of humans and even some rudimentary boats, a sure sign of progress which was slow but also steady. The Sahara Desert at the time was once a lush green plain which would not look dissimilar to the grasslands of Africa today. Flora and fauna were abundant in this now desolate landscape, which is why the hunters were drawn there in the first place. Unbeknownst to these early pioneers, a geological event would drastically change their home. The Earth's axis tilted by half a degree, and this changed the climate into what, over time, would become the largest desert on Earth. The hunters were forced to congregate around the remaining lakes scattered throughout the area. This created settlements such as the village of Playa. This village, while small, is where one of the many firsts this ingenious people achieved. Because of the new arid climate, circa 5000 BC, the early Egyptians came up with one of the first known calendars to mark the passage of time. While crude looking, these simple stones would cast certain shadows at different times of the year to indicate the impending wet season. This is also the first example of Egyptians' well-known love affair with the stars and astrology. A shining example of the ingenuity of humanity when put under pressure. Playa is also home of the very first crude carvings of what would later become the many gods they worshipped. At first these carvings were very animalistic, but as the centuries passed, they started to take on more human features and become the gods we see in the many hieroglyphs of later millennia. While its feats are certainly impressive, Playa was doomed, and as the climate became more and more arid, the lakes where these people's source of water was eventually dried. There was only one other option, and that was to move to the next closest water source, which just so happened to be the River Nile. The fertile land around the River Nile would be the fuel which kick-started the immense growth of this once small nomadic population of thousands to what would become 1.5 million by the time of the First Dynasty. Even today, this land can be replanted just weeks after farmers have harvested the previous crops. Of all the new settlements, two stand out among the rest. In the north there was Fayum and Kina in the south. These towns would be the de facto capitals of what would be known as the Upper and Lower Kingdoms of Egypt. From around 4200 BC, as agriculture took hold and the lands became more and more like the desert we know today, a nomadic lifestyle gradually faded. Farming became the new norm in what was now the middle of the pre-dynastic period. Archaeologists have noted that around this period, pottery became more and more commonplace from this time. This is a vitally important finding, as it indicates the need for storage of a food surplus. Once a civilization has a food surplus, their time can be spent on other things besides gathering resources, which is how art and culture can flourish. Mummies are one of the enduring images when we think about ancient Egypt today. The pre-dynastic period is also the origin of this tradition, and it is thought that the climate also influenced these practices. The earliest of these mummies were found around 3400 BC. The dry desert air would naturally mummify the bodies, and many burial mounds have been found with belongings of the deceased. A belief that the person could take their belongings to the afterlife with them was present hundreds of years before the Great Pyramids were constructed. The ancient city of Abydos, located on the west bank of the Nile, was also home to the progenitor of the Valley of the Kings, and was known as the Dead City. Another incredible discovery came from this city: small ivory bone labels, which were attached to pots dated back to 3250 BC, which had various symbols adorning them. These symbols were thought to represent towns and villages who sent tributes to Abydos as an early form of taxation. The Egyptians were thought to be able to phonetically translate these symbols, so in another first, this is the earliest form of writing which would later become the Egyptian alphabet known as hieroglyphics. For hundreds of years, the upper and lower kingdoms of the Nile traded and cooperated, but were two very distinct cultures. The upper kingdom was known to be much more aggressive and was looking to expand its territory. The issue is that in an area with so little fertile land, the only direction to go was to follow the Nile. Tensions grew and inevitably war broke out. The ultimate battle to decide the fate of these nations is depicted in a piece called the Naramar Palace. As you can see, the image depicted is of King Naramar striking a bitter blow to his rival. This exact pose is used for millennia by Naramar's successors, possibly as a way to legitimize and connect him to this founder king. Naramar's victory in 3100 BC signified the beginning of the First Dynasty. The First Dynasty united both upper and lower kingdoms and created the world's first nation-state, with Memphis as its capital. At this time, pharaohs, possibly fearing their own mortality, became obsessed with death and burials. The belief that one could travel to the afterlife with their belongings and servants was well established and led to some horrific practices. Thankfully, this practice did not last long, as the impracticalities were soon seen of hiring hundreds of new servants and assistants for the new pharaoh. The capital Memphis had a city of the dead by the name of Sahara. This is where kings would display their power and divinity with ever more elaborate tombs. It was one of these displays that led to the first pyramid. Regular royal tombs consisted of an underground crypt with a one-story building above. The pharaoh Djoser, possibly wanting to one-up his predecessors, decided to build more and more stories on top of his own until it took the shape of a pyramid. Interestingly, the architect of Djoser's pyramid was the pharaoh Imhotep, famous for rising through the ranks as a commoner to the most powerful man in the land. The blueprint would continue on for the next few centuries. Over 130 pyramids were built, culminating in the Great Pyramid built in 2570 BC for the king Khufu. Thank you so much for watching. I know most history buffs are aware of Egypt in its heyday, but I for one was interested to find its origins, and I learned a lot of new information along the way. I hope you learned something new too, and if not, then thanks for sticking around anyway. I will be making more videos on whatever comes to mind in the near future, so I hope you check them out. Thanks again, and I'll talk to you next time.